Look what I found lying at the side of the road. Sometimes you get lucky, I guess. Of course, I rushed home, squeezed this fat pig into my case and ran some benchmarks. Let's see how the 5080 stacks up against a 3090 Founders Edition in flight simulations. I've got data from Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, DCS and IL-2 Stürmovik Great Battles. I also ran 3DMark Steel Nomad and TimeSpy for some synthetic results. My CPU is a 5800X 3D boosting at 4.4 GHz, and the rest of the specs are in the description. My VR headset is a Pico 4 connected via cable running at 90 Hz. I was pretty surprised by how hard the 5080 goes once you overclock it, something we haven't seen much of lately with GPUs, but see for yourself. Let's quickly go through the synthetic benchmarks for a general impression. The 3090 scored 5,143 points in Steel Nomad, while the 5080 hit 8,157. Overclocking the GPU to 400 MHz core and 2 GHz memory, simple as entering two values in MSI Afterburner and cranking the power limit up to 111%, resulted in a score of 8,864. That's a 58.7% increase in performance and 70.4% overclocked. The overclocked GPU is roughly 8.7% faster than stock. In TimeSpy, the 3090 scored 17,522, while the stock 5080 reached 24,575. Overclocking it pushed the score to 26,569. That's a 40% increase over the 3090, and with overclocking, the 5080 becomes 52% faster, an additional 8% boost. Not bad overall, I'd say. Now, let's move on to Flight Simulator 2020. I always start 174 feet above the Louvre in Paris. Here are my settings. Pause and check them out if you're interested. Both traffic and real-time weather are deactivated. We're using DLSS on balanced with the J preset. In 4K Pancake mode, the 3090 averages at 86 FPS and peaks at 100. The 5080, both stock and overclocked, delivers 97 and 111 FPS respectively. This suggests we're still CPU limited here, something I failed to notice while benchmarking the 3090. But don't worry, we've got some better data coming up. Lowering terrain and object detail to 100 bumped the overclocked 5080 to 100 FPS average and 121 FPS max. This is an improvement, but we're still held back by the CPU. The more interesting results, though, are in VR. Before we get there, let's wrap up the Pancake numbers. We saw a modest 12% performance gain, which increased to 21% once we eased the CPU strain. Now, let's move on to the VR benchmarks. The 3090 averages at 36 FPS and maxes out at 41. The stock 5080 pushes that up to 49 FPS average and 58 FPS max. Overclocking the 5080 boosts FPS to 57 average and 62 max. While we're still CPU limited over Paris, that's a noticeable improvement. Stock, the 5080 shows a 36% boost in average FPS and a 41% increase in max FPS. Overclocked, the gains are even better. 58% higher average FPS and 51% more in max FPS. Comparing stock to overclocked 5080, we get a 16% increase in average FPS and a 7% increase in max FPS. Next up is IL-2 Stürmovik. For my benchmark, I used the opening sequence of the 10 Days of Autumn campaign, featuring heavy rain and ground units. Here are my settings. Pause if you like to take a closer look. No upscaling is used, and we're running 4 times MSAA. The 3090 in Pancake mode averages at 130 FPS, peaking at 143 FPS. The stock 5080, on the other hand, delivers 184 FPS average and 215 FPS max. Overclocking bumps that up to 193 FPS average and 230 FPS max. This means we're seeing a 42% increase in average FPS with the stock 5080 and 48% when overclocked. Max FPS improves by 50% stock and 61% overclocked. which means overclocking gives us an extra 5% average FPS and 7% more max FPS. In VR, the 3090 averages at 55 FPS and peaks at 61 FPS. The 5080 stock offers 83 FPS average and 107 FPS max, and with overclocking, those numbers rise up to 90 FPS average and 111 FPS max. Stock, the 5080 shows a 51% boost in average FPS and a 70% increase in max FPS. Overclocked, we get 63% higher average FPS and 82% more max FPS. That's an additional 8% increase in average FPS when overclocked. Finally, let's check out DCS. For this one, I created a mission on the Persian Gulf map with a bunch of ground units engaging each other. Here are my settings. Pause if you want to take a closer look. No upscaling here either, but we're running DLAA this time. The 3090 sets the Pancake pace with an average of 94 FPS and a max of 100. The stock 5080 comes in at 159 FPS average and 166 FPS max. Overclocked, we get a 174 FPS average and 183 FPS max. That's a 69% increase in average FPS over the 3090 stock and 85% when overclocked. Max FPS increases by 66% stock and 83% overclocked, giving us roughly a 10% boost in both average and max FPS from stock to overclocked. In VR, the 3090 sets the bar at 48 FPS average and 50 FPS max. The stock 5080 delivers 77 FPS average and 90 FPS max. Overclocking bumps that up to 80 FPS average and 98 FPS max. This means the stock 5080 is 60% faster in terms of average FPS, and overclocking boosts that to 67%. Max FPS increased by 80% stock and 96% overclocked. This means overclocking gives us an additional 4% increase in average FPS and 9% more max FPS. Before we go to the conclusion, I just got new, faster RAM with better timings. This pushed Steel Nomad beyond 9000 points, which is another 1.5% faster compared to the overclocked results. On the AM4 platform, depending on the game, faster RAM than DDR4 3000 in general yields between nothing and 5% in FPS, in some cases up to 10%. So you might keep that in mind. So what's the bottom line? If we have the CPU power to support the 5080, the gains are huge across the board, especially in VR. The 1% lows also mostly increase as much as the average FPS, which gives us much more constant frame rates than with the 3090. Coming from one, I'm kinda happy with the 5080 so far. But does this mean the 5080 is a good GPU? Well, somewhat if you don't own a 4080 or better. Overclocked, we gain 8 to 12% more performance over stock, depending on the game. That's how the card should have shipped in the first place, in my opinion. The distance to the 4080 Super increases to over 20% this way. 16 GB of VRAM is a disgrace for a 2025 80 series card though. And if you look closely at the card's specs and its distance to the flagship, it should have been a 70 series card in my opinion. Hardware Unboxed made a good video on the topic, link in the description. So why did I buy it? First of all, my 3090 will sell for a good price since people will probably use the 24 GB of VRAM to run AI stuff on it. Also, the 5080 is faster in the games I play and will sell for more or at least the same amount of money once the 60 series launches at some point in 2026 maybe. And I'm a YouTuber. My job is to provide you with detailed insights into new gear you're probably interested in. This way you can make an informed decision about whether it's the right choice for you or a hard pass. So here's my recommendation. If you can sit out the 50 generation, I suggest you do so. It's kind of disappointing and grossly overpriced. The new features like mega geometry or neural rendering are bets on the future. We'll have to see whether they make a big difference or not. Nvidia doesn't know what to do with all the money anyway. So unless it's absolutely necessary, like your card broke, don't fatten them up any further. Such low-effort products don't deserve to be rewarded. Make sure to check out my HOTAS overview as well if you're into flight sim gear or just randomly binge the rest of my channel maybe. Take care, fly safe, and see you soon.